The 1990s were a lot of fun. I know, I was actually there. I was in elementary school, but I was there. So here's what I remember. Pogs, Pokemon, O.J. Simpson, the Spice Girls. The Simpsons were actually good. And really, really, really slow internet. And then everyone thought the world was gonna explode at the end of the 90s. Some people may have even been counting on it. But alas, it didn't. Roller coasters also took a major turn in the 90s. B&M got their start. CCI and GCI joined soon after. Intamin started stepping up their game. And Vekoma. Well, we don't talk about 90s Vekoma. The 90s also introduced a whole new style of music. We put away the synthesizer and said hello to grunge. That heavy metal, hard rock, emo mix. And that gave way to the music that I remember when I was a kid. And in my opinion, it was great. Today, let's count down the world's greatest 90s coasters and pair them with the best songs of the decade. Number 15, When I Come Around by Green Day, 1994, and Dueling Dragons at Islands of Adventure, 1999. When Islands of Adventure opened that year, they had two monster B&Ms. Well, technically three. Dueling Dragons was two separate inverted coasters, having completely different layouts, and they were synced up to interact at different points. An airtime hill and a zero-G roll, two loops right next to each other, intertwining corkscrews. When this opened, it was the Fire Dragon and the Ice Dragon, located in the Lost Continent section of the park. In 2010, that was rethemed to the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and this was rethemed to Dragon Challenge, now with a Chinese fireball and Hungarian horntail. Not long after, there was an incident where someone got hurt with a flying object, and the two sides would no longer duel. This was the beginning of the end, and it was phased out of its area, closing in 2017. It was replaced by the $300 million Hagrid's Motorbike Adventure. I rode this in 2012. It wasn't dueling, and I thought the blue side was just okay, but the red side was excellent. They stood 125 feet tall, covered 3,200 feet of track, had 5 inversions, but they had completely different layouts. Number 14, Creep by Radiohead, 1993, and Volcano the Blast Coaster at King's Dominion, 1998. Of all the coasters that Paramount added to their parks, I give them the most credit for this. They had a big empty mountain, the one that used to have the Smurf ride inside, and they turned to Intamin and asked for the world's first launch inverted coaster. This would launch its riders up to 70 miles an hour, up and out over the top, covering over 2,700 feet of track in 4 inversions, wrapping and twisting around the mountain. It was such a fun and iconic coaster. I got to ride this in 2008, and it was the best coaster the park had to offer for years. Being so innovative, this had a ton of problems from the start, and by 2018, it was too much to handle. The park shut it down, tore down the coaster and the mountain, and we sit and wait to see what's coming next. Number 13, Losing My Religion by R.E.M., 1993, and Raven at Holiday World, 1995. After Will Cook became the president of Holiday World, the park really took off. He added Splashin' Safari in 1993, and then got this awesome CCI wooden coaster in 1995. It's not very big, just 80 feet tall, tops out at 48 miles an hour, and covers 2,800 feet of track, taking place mostly out in the woods. Despite its size, its layout was insane. Just a breakneck, airtime-filled experience, and when I rode this in 2002, it was my number 2 wooden coaster. It's dropped a bit, and it's gotten rougher over the years, but Holiday World takes good care of it, and the ride experience holds up to this day. Number 12, 1979 by the Smashing Pumpkins, 1995, and Alpengeist at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, 1997. Here's the first B&M invert on the list, but it won't be the last. Themed as a runaway ski lift, this takes its riders all the way up to 195 feet. Still the tallest inverted coaster ever built, and it's not even close. It's almost 30 feet taller than Banshee. It maxes out at 67 miles an hour, over 3,800 feet of track, and 6 inversions. When I last rode this in 2022, it was so smooth and so intense in that first half. I was blown away by the experience. It seems like this invert gets overlooked, and that's hard to do for a coaster that's almost 200 feet tall, but it's truly elite. Number 11, The Way by Fastball, 1998, and Eagle Fortress at Everland, 1992. Most of these coasters are from the US, but there were 2 overseas that made the top 15. I really wish I could have ridden this aero-suspended coaster, located at Everland in South Korea from 1992 to 2009, rising up a big hill, never really leaving the ground, winding its way back down, picking up speed the whole way, maxing out at just 40 miles an hour, but those tight turns made that car swing like crazy, covering 3,200 feet of track. This flew through the trees, getting more chaotic as the ride went along, and even though I never rode it, It seems like it deserves a spot here. Number 10, Back to Good by Matchbox 20, 1996, and The Incredible Hulk at Allens of Adventure, 1999. We already talked about Dueling Dragons, and now we have the park's true icon, The Incredible Hulk, a massive B&M looping coaster. This is very well themed, not only in the queue, but also to start the ride. You start with a slow lift inside a tunnel, themed as a gamma ray accelerator, and as you're crawling up that lift, it uses spinning tires to launch you into a 0G roll, then a cobra roll, 2 loops, 2 corkscrews, 7 inversions total, covering 3,700 feet of track. This is one of the most intense coasters I've ever ridden. When I rode this last in 2021, it was pushing my head down the entire time, from the first launch to the final brakes. It's just a relentless ride. Ever since it got retracked in 2016, it's also running very smooth. Number 9, Inside Out by Eve 6, 1998, and Ride of Steel at Six Flags Darien Lake, 1999. 99 was a big year for hypers, and Ride of Steel was the first one that Intamin introduced. This was called Superman Ride of Steel when it opened, standing 208 feet tall, maxing out at 73 miles an hour, covering 5,400 feet of track, and to say the least, it has a weird layout. It has a couple big hills, a few small hills, 2 enormous helices, and that famous straight track right over the lake. I finally got to ride this in 2018 and I really enjoyed it. It has those great wide open Intamin trains and just a T-bar, but the layout isn't strong enough for this to be ranked higher. Number 8, One Headlight by the Wallflowers, 1996, and Apollo's Chariot at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, 1999. From Intamin's first hyper to B&M's first hyper, Apollo's Chariot is the first thing you see when you drive up the Busch Gardens. It stands 170 feet tall, but drops into a ravine, a 210-foot drop, going through big camelbacks, a sweeping turnaround, and finishing with smaller hills, covering almost 4,900 feet of track. This is geared for airtime and not much else, set out among the trees and hard to see from the park. It looks great, it's a smooth ride, and when I rode this in 2008, it became my favorite steel coaster. My last 2 rides in 2019 and 2022 weren't as impressive. The airtime wasn't as strong as other B&M hypers, so I had to drop it. That being said, if you sit in the back row, you can't help but enjoy the floater air and long ride time. Number 7, Push by Matchbox 20, 1996, and Steel Eel from SeaWorld San Antonio, 1999. From an Intamin hyper, to a B&M hyper, to a Morgan mini hyper, Steel Eel proves size isn't everything. This only stands 150 feet tall, but its layout puts it on this list. It has some of the most violent airtime I've ever experienced, and it's not because of strong ejector, crushing your thighs against a lap bar. It's sustained weightlessness going down all those big drops, and when you bottom out, you land hard in your seat. It really hurts your butt, and in my opinion, it's worth it for the great airtime. I used to not be a fan of the second half. It was just too slow to give good airtime, but my rides in 2022 were totally different. That second half was nuts, and I had to move this back into my top 50. Number 6, Scar Tissue by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, 1999, and Nemesis at Alton Towers, 1994. This is the second and final international coaster on this list, and the second and final coaster on the list that I haven't ridden. I can only go by reputation, and Nemesis has a great one. Because Alton Towers can't build above the tree line, Nemesis was built into the ground, using an extensive and expensive network of trenches. And as annoying as that sounds for the park, it really gives the ride its identity. 42.6 feet tall, 50 miles an hour, 2,349 feet of track, and 4 inversions. This is themed to a nasty creature attacking the park, and the roller coaster is the mechanism pinning the monster down. Of all the coasters in the UK, I think this is the one that's highest on my bucket list. Number 5, Slide by the Goo Goo Dolls, 1998, and Shivering Timbers at Michigan's Adventure, 1998. Before Cedar Fair came along and boxed this park out from getting anything new, they got themselves an iconic coaster. This is the most beautiful wooden coaster in the world, and it's the first thing you see when you drive to the park. It's 122 feet tall, almost built like a steel hypercoaster with those big camelbacks going out, the big turnaround, and then the smaller hills coming back, ending with a helix before the brakes, covering over a mile of track. I knew about this coaster for over 20 years before I finally got to ride it in 2021, and it did not let me down. It ran a bit rough on those big hills, and I don't like those PTC trains and lap bars, but the airtime was real, the ride was long, and the final helix was amazingly smooth. As long as this is still here and operational, Michigan's Adventure is worth the trip. Number 4, Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind, 1997, and Raptor at Cedar Point, 1994. B&M had just invented the inverted coaster 2 years prior, and up to this point, they were kinda small. Cedar Point, like they always do, wanted the biggest one and they got it. Located right in the midway, Raptor rises up 137 feet, hits 57 miles an hour, going into a course that covers almost 3,800 feet of track, and goes through 6 inversions. Some people call this rough, But as of my rides in 2021, I thought it was just fine. When that mid-course brake run is off, that elevates the ride to an elite level. That second half has 2 corkscrews and a helix, and those are extremely intense and full of whip. I was so impressed on my last trip, I had to move it up to number 2 on my invert list, and that's a perfect segue to my next coaster. Number 3, Smooth by Santana and Rob Thomas, 1999, and Montu at Busch Gardens Tampa, 1996. It took me way too long to get to Busch Gardens Tampa, so I had to hear about how great Montu was for a good 18 years. After my first trip in 2018, and after 4 rides, I was sold. Montu is the best invert in America. For one, it's huge. It stands 150 feet tall, hits 60 miles an hour, covers 7 inversions, almost 4,000 feet of track, and its best feature are those tunnels and trenches. If you want one insane intense moment, ride that Batwing in the back row. Because it's in a trench, you pick up that much more speed, and it feels like it's gonna rip off your feet. The second half is the cherry on top, taking place almost entirely below the ground, starting with a loop and wrapping around into a corkscrew. Montu really lives up to the hype. Number 2, Mr. Jones by the Counting Crows, 1993, and Raging Bull at Six Flags Great America, 1999. When B&M built their first 2 hypers in 1999, one was a very conventional out-and-back layout in Apollo's Chariot, and the other was a twister model in Raging Bull. Surprisingly, I enjoy the twister model much more. This ride stands 202 feet tall, dropping 208 feet into a tunnel, and because of that pre-drop, if you ride in the back row, you get some of the greatest airtime ever on the first drop. Apollo's Chariot has the same thing, but it's nowhere near as good. This has camelbacks, high turns, a great drop off the mid-course brakes, smaller hills, a helix, and this ride covers over 5,000 feet of track. Every time I go to Great America, I can't stop riding Raging Bull. Of all the great coasters that park has, I find myself lapping Raging Bull as many times as I can. For me, it's a borderline top 10 coaster. Number 1, You Get What You Give by the New Radicals, 1998, and Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm, 1998. Before the Knott family sold the park to Cedar Fair, they had one last great contribution. Ghost Rider is a 118-foot tall, 56-mile-an-hour wooden coaster that extends out into the parking lot, covering over 4,500 feet of track and having a double out-and-back L-shaped layout, the final lap running inside the structure of the first lap. For me, this is one of the great layouts of all time, wood or steel. It's just a relentless run of airtime and laterals, broken up by a scenic turnaround right over the station, showcasing the whole park. Then it dives straight down, one of the great airtime moments ever in the back row, and that second half is sharp and violent. After his 2016 retrack, and switch from PTC trains to Millennium Flyers, Ghost Rider is basically a perfect wooden coaster. Smooth, but not too smooth, and all the airtime room you want. For me, this is the world's best coaster from the 90s, and it was my number 1 overall coaster from 2001 to 2008. That's a wrap on the top coasters and my favorite songs from the 1990s. Let me know where you agree or disagree, what coasters should have been added on here, and what your favorite song is from the decade. There were so many coasters I had to leave off, like Great Bear, Afterburn, Tennessee Tornado, Viper from Magic Mountain, and Great America, and a couple international contenders, like Pyrenees at Parque España, and Fujiyama at Fuji-Q Highland, both in Japan. So if there was anything else that deserves to be on here from around the world, let me know in the comments below. Before you go, don't forget to drop a like, and if you're new here and love coasters, please give me a sub. I have a playlist with other decades in this series. Also, check out my links below for my Discord server, and my second channel where I post copyright-free off-ride footage, and my baseball channel if you also happen to love baseball. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.